They laughed when the slave said she would save the heir, until he opened his eyes. The words slipped into the room like a verdict, brittle with disbelief. The sick room at São Vicente smelled of sweat and boiled herbs, of onion from the stew that had never been eaten, of lamp oil and the sour metallic tang of fever. Curtains of thin linen hung half-closed over the windows to keep the worst of the sun away. Even so, heat hugged the rafters and pressed the people together. Joaquim lay on the pallet, a boy's face stretched by fever into a stranger's skin. For 5 days he retched and muttered, drifting in and out of a delirium no one could steer. The physician from the nearest town had come and declared exhaustion. A benzadera who mended bones and whispered charms had tied ribbons of cloth and sung until the words wore thin. The priest had come with quiet hands and a cross that could not turn the tide. Nothing worked. Maria Firmina stood at the foot of the pallet, as if she had always belonged there. She had the slow, unassuming authority of someone who has kept watch over life and death. So often she had learned how small things stack up into saving. Her hands, work-worn and nimble, were neither proud nor showy. She folded a linen cloth and dipped it into a wooden bowl of tepid water scented with lemon and guava leaves. Around her 3 men and 4 women waited. Antonia, Joaquim's mother, pale and clinging to the bedpost, the fighter, eyes hard as the iron of his cane, a cousin who kept muttering the names of saints as if listing them would summon relief, 2 servants who had been detailed to attend, and a cluster of neighbors whose curiosity outweighed compassion. "Let her try," murmured one of the women, but their voices were edged with the kind of pity that is also a dismissal. She is a slave, they thought. What can she know about a señor's son? The word slave sits in the mouth like a stone. It shaped the whole room, an invisible rule no one wanted to break. Maria did not insist. She had learned not to insist in places where insistence cost lives. She had learned to wait until people's faces softened from embarrassment into the kind of gratitude that respects no boundaries. She began to wash Joaquim's forehead with the cloth, slow, patient strokes that did not startle him. For hours she would work in the same economy of motion, a rinse, a fold, a press, each movement measured and unhurried, as if mending a torn shirt were the same as mending a fevered mind. The laughter came when she spoke up, not loud but undeniable, a ripple of nervousness and scorn from those who had watched years of custom teach them that help from the Chenzala, the slave quarters, could never be medicine for a white heir. "A slave?" someone said. "She will sing him to worse dreams." The fighter's lips twitched. Antonia's hands tightened on the bedpost. Some laughed, because laughter is small people's defense against the cold, and some because it was easier than confronting how vulnerable their order had become. Maria did not answer the laughter. She tilted a cup of water onto the cloth and held it steady beneath the fevered brow. Then she bent close and spoke in a voice so low only the boy beneath the blanket might hear. Not words of prayer the priest would have recognized, not invocations from Donna Jacinta, the benzadera. She told him of the river, of its cold pool under the tamarind where the children hid from the sun. She told him a story about a man who could not stop working until a woman taught him to do nothing for a little while, and in that doing, everything came back. These were not formulas, but names. They were images that tethered a floating mind to a particular human life. When Joaquim's breath steadied, the people in the room felt it like a shift in the wind. He blinked, and for a second the eyes that opened were clear and young. The laughter cut off. Antonia let out a sound that was half sob and half laugh that had nowhere to go. Joaquim's first intelligible question, in a thin voice like someone waking from a long dream, "Severino? Severino." The name dropped from the palate into the quiet, and at once, days that had been compartmentalized for everyone in São Vicente rearranged their order. Where laughter had been, silence fell. No one had expected that he would ask for the old man, an elder of the Chenzala, bent but sturdy, who had carried sacks of coffee and a store of village stories in his chest. He was a man whose hands remembered the rhythm of the land better than anyone's. The laugh stopped, because a question had become an accusation, sudden and simple. The heir's voice naming the name made responsibilities visible in the room. The fighter's knuckles whitened around his cane. Antonia's fingers slid from the bedpost as if she'd been burned. Eyes darted to the doorway, then to one another, searching for permission to breathe again. Maria did not look up at them much. She kept her hands steady, wiped his lips, adjusted his pillow. When she did raise her face, the look she gave had no surprise, only a steady acceptance, the calm of someone who had known a life measured by tending. "He needs to be given broth and shade," she said simply, "and salt in water for his mouth." When he opened his eyes, the room held for a moment as if collecting itself. For those who had laughed, it was a small thing and a great one at the same time, the victory of a single breath over the dark. For Maria, it was not a miracle she could claim, only the result of baths compresses, watching for the precise tilt of the head that meant the fever was loosening its hold. After that opening, the narrative of San Vicente rewound itself to the corner where this illness had first begun. 3 days earlier, when Severino had stumbled under the weight of a sack, and a new order had been given, with a voice that meant to instruct as much as to punish. 3 days before the fever, the coffee fields had been green bands cutting the hill like a ledger of the harvest. Sun struck the rows and made the leaves shine. It was labor as architecture, measured steps, the steady posture of men and women who could read an early frost by the angle of the light. Severino had worked for the plantation longer than many could remember. He had a way of moving that made young laborers look up, a patient cadence in the way his hands folded the beans that read like a teaching. That morning he had misstepped on a loose stone. The sack tore a little, some beans spilt across the red earth, and for that tiny accident the fighter watched with a face like a weathered gate. He ruled by economy, a missed bean, a missed ration. Joaquim was there that day, irritable from the fever's whispering to come, giving orders through a mouth that wanted to be sure he was obeyed. He was young and unpracticed at scarcity, at the bitter arithmetic of discipline. "Half rations for 3 days, the fighter pronounced, as if measuring humiliation was part of the ledger. Stupidity must teach. Severino bowed his head and endured it. He had long ago learned that dignity is not a currency here. Endurance is. Maria watched the whole exchange. She had been in and out of the fields that day, basket on her arm, the smell of freshly cut grass in her hair. She saw how Severino's chest tightened when the punishment was named, how the younger hands around him shifted, embarrassed at witnessing the humiliation. She knew what hunger does to a body carrying years of work. She knew, too, how a man's spirit can flag under the slow, grinding weight of small injustices. But she could not step forward then. To protest would have meant danger not only to herself but to others. A woman who speaks up in certain places invites a swift, cruel correction that would be visited on everyone she tended. She had a family in the Cenzala who relied on her prudence, a child who had just found steady breathing after a cough, an old woman whose back had given out last winter. Each act was a calculation. Severino did not die that day. But the ration cut began a descent. Thin meals, nights of coughing that went unattended, a slow unspooling of the strong that makes way for sudden collapse. Maria shifted into the only power she had, the knowledge of plants and the patient watching of symptoms. She had spent her childhood by a river, learning which leaves poultice a bruise and which roots eased fevers. She had listened to grandmothers who taught her when to feed and when to withhold food so the stomach could rest. Her expertise was not recognized by any paper or title, but it held weight in actual lives. She set aside the small stores she could spare, ginger, lemon, a broth fat with beans, and began visiting the Cenzala at dusk. The Cenzala, the row of simple huts where the enslaved slept, smelled of smoke and patchwork clothes, and the soft damp of life lived close. There were children there who braided each other's hair, and old men who whittled pieces of wood into toys. The Cenzala was a place of stories and small graces. Its people lived in a careful economy of mutual aid that the plantation's ledger never accounted for. Severino received her care with the gratitude of an elder who knows he is not owed miracles. Maria would sit by his pallet and speak quietly about the river or about a dog that used to chase oranges into a neighbor's yard. She would rub his legs with oil and set a cloth warmed in sun across his chest. The medicine was patience and attention, and watching how a man's breath found a different path when someone sat with him in the dark and listened. Meanwhile, Joaquim's fever smoldered like a secret the household refused to name. He slept and woke with fever dreams and with flashes of clarity that frightened him more than the illness. In those clear flashes, the world flashed into focus. The lines of hands in the coffee rows, the tired faces, the way children's shoes were threadbare. In his delirium, he heard snippets, voices lined up like a chorus, Severino's cough, Maria's low murmur, a child's laugh clipped by hunger. Donna Jacinta came one evening with a bundle of herbs and a song. She did what she could. Smoke the walls with rosemary, burn a rope of sage, stitch small cloths with lemon, and hang them by the bed. The priest came with prayers and a blessing that landed soft as dust. The physician adjusted the sleeping draughts and ordered more broth and rest. Each offered a piece, and none of them alone could pull him back. When Maria returned to the house on the night the fever began to break, she carried in her hands a bowl more than a remedy, water, linen, and the simple ritual of attending. She had learned rituals longer than any book. Presence, she believed, could be a remedy when all else failed. When Joaquim finally spoke his first clear name, the one he loved from the Cenzala, he did not know he had promised a reckoning no one in that room expected. Names have a way of opening doors shut for years. For Joaquim to ask about Severino invited a question. What do we do now that the heir remembers? Antonia moved like someone who is trying to shore up a crumbling wall. She had been mistress of San Vicente in the practical senses for years. Payments, accounts, the ordering of servants, and the negotiation with neighbors who had grown as accustomed to Pereira family authority as to the seasons. Her fear was not only for her son's health, it was of what change would cost the order she had upheld all her life. "It is a fever," she insisted to anyone who would listen. But even in that phrase there was a plea for normalcy, yet Joaquim did not ask for platitudes. When his voice came again, firmer this time, he demanded food enough for Severino. He ordered fresh linens for the Cenzala, and water brought to the quarters without the usual scowl that accompanied anyone requesting help. He did not speak through the fighter. He spoke directly, the way a man newly returned from the brink sometimes commands the world, with an impatience at its old offenses. Those commands reverberated. The fighter's jaw tightened until a line of anger showed there. Anger at being bypassed, fear at losing grip on authority. In the Cenzala, the news moved like a warm current. The Señor had spoken, faces stretched into cautious hope. A woman who was mending a child's shirt paused as if to listen for permission to believe. Maria watched all of this with a quiet that did not change. She had no illusions about the durability of gestures. She had seen kind words that dried in the sun within a day. She had seen new decrees that lasted a season and then dissolved. But something in Joaquim's eyes had shifted, not fully to contrition but to attention. Attention is the beginning of repair. In the late afternoon after he opened his eyes, Joaquim walked slowly through San Vicente as if feeling the ground again. He asked to be shown the Cenzala. Antonia protested, as a mother does when she fears exposure for the family name, but Joaquim moved with a stubbornness that would not be argued into conformity. He half leaned on a cane, not so much for need as for an anchor. The fever had thinned him, but it had sharpened his senses. He looked at the huts, at the patched roofs, at the collection of oilskins and patched shoes. He listened when a child told him how he had been saving his bread for Sunday, and how rats had taken some the week before. He looked at Severino and saw not only an old man but a ledger of labor that had forged the province. That evening in the kitchen, Maria and Antonia stood opposite one another with a pot between them. It would have been easy in another household for Antonia to strip Maria of any agency and return her to the role of silent instrument. But Antonia was a woman who had long since learned the economy of fear. She also had the habits of gratitude. When Joaquim asked for Severino's ration and for a bowl of broth to be sent, Antonia obeyed with the mechanical obedience of someone who has always kept house by doing what commands dictate. Her heart, though, beat fast with unease. What would the neighbors say when they heard? What would Coronel Mendez, who had the authority of threat in his gate, think if he saw any signals of change at San Vicente? The fighter, meanwhile, listened and planned. He gathered the men he trusted and walked past the Cenzala with a look of controlled fury. "Discipline must be kept," he muttered. Discipline, in the arithmetic of the plantation, was not only about obedience, It was a language of the farm's survival as the fighter understood it. To him, small mercies for those who worked the land were dangerous precedents. Mercy, he believed, mutated respect into insolence. In the Cenzala, the children watched Joaquim's slow progress with the kind of careful optimism that is taught by hunger and by memory. Optimism that always keeps a door for disappointment. Maria sat outside with Severino propped up on pillows. The old man's eyes were brighter than they had been, but his voice remained soft. He took Maria's hand and said nothing, because some gratitude is a look exchanged between souls who have shared a long life. That night, Joaquim found himself restless. Sleep did not come easily. Images of workers' hands turned the inside of his chest like a wind in leaves. He fetched a notebook, an action that had once been reserved for ledgers and harvest lists, and he wrote a few lines, awkward, unpracticed, the small inventory of compassion, water for the Cenzala, blankets mended, a bowl of soup daily for the elders. He also scribbled a name, Severino. The act of writing seemed to anchor him. It was not a plan yet, only a line of intention. Maria watched him from the doorway without asking to be seen. She had seen men change before, some in small ways, some not at all. She knew the difference between a man who wishes to be kind and a man who will alter the structures that harness cruelty. Still, she had been given room to act here. Someone had listened. That is the first and most dangerous thing a person can do. Listen. Listening opens one to responsibility. In the following days, small reforms followed. Water barrels were rolled closer to the Cenzala, so no one had to walk a long way carrying heavy jugs under the noon sun. A local carpenter was ordered to mend the roofs of the huts so that rain would not soak bedding. The fighter's license to administer punishments without report was questioned. These were modest things, but to those who had lived in the slow grind of neglect, they shimmered like distant fires on the horizon, possible warmth at the end of a long night. Not everyone approved. Whispers began to travel to neighboring fazendas. Men on horseback with the faces of authority paused at the gates and asked questions of servants who were too frightened to answer fully. The name Coronel Mendez came up in conversations like a shadow. He was a man whose holdings rivaled Pereira's and who held social power cultivated by years of alliances and the tacit threat of violence. He had never liked novelties that softened the hand of management. For him and others of his circle, the order of things kept markets steady and men predictable. Loose kindness, in their terms, threatened that order. Antonia, observing the shifting currents, felt her fear deepen into something more complex, a fear for her son's future and a fear for the household's standing. She moved between a mother's relief at her child's survival and a manager's anxiety about precedent. Her face, already mapped with age, found itself in dialogue with the past and the future. "We must be careful," she whispered to Joaquim when they were alone, hands folded over a cup of plain tea. "The estate is not only ours. We have neighbors and creditors, and a world that will not be kind to changes that cut against the grain." Joaquim's answer was not a speech. It was a look that suggested he had seen a broader ledger than the one he had once managed. For a man who had been raised to think management and kindness incompatible, the two began to seem threads that might one day be woven together. He did not yet know how to do that. He only knew that he could not return to the complacency that had allowed Severino to be punished into weakness. The memory of the laughter in the sickroom, sharp, contemptuous, stayed with him like a sting. There were minor victories that warmed the Cenzala. A new basin for washing, a bolt of cloth to mend children's shoes, a promise that the fighter would report any corporal punishment to the master, rather than take measures at whim. Yet as soon as gestures were visible, so too were the ripples of discontent. The fighter muttered in the barracks. Neighbors made jokes that were not kind. Some of the workers looked at Joaquim with something between hope and suspicion. They had seen the cycles of promise and retraction. They had learned to hope small. Maria, for her part, continued to do what she had always done. Tend, teach, listen. But she also began to keep a careful ledger of her own, not in writing, but in decisions. She would not leave the Cenzala now without checking on a child's fever. She would attend to the repairs with hands that a carpenter's wife would recognize and a master would underestimate. She had been made visible in a way that both offered possibility and risk. People in power sometimes did kind things for those below when it cost them little, and gained them praise. Other times they did the same acts tethered to deeper decisions that would alter how the whole estate operated. Maria could not tell which this would be. What she could do was plant a small seed. Seeds, she had learned as a child, take more water than ceremony. The act of saving a life was not a single dramatic moment, but a string of small choices stitched together until they became habit. To her, the fever's end was not an end, but the beginning of a long, slow work. Repairing roofs, mending shoes, opening the well. She had no illusion that one boy's recovery would mean the end of suffering. She knew better. Systems resist. Yet she also knew that some changes begin because someone listens and alters how they breathe in the world. Word of Joaquim's orders traveled beyond the property gates as rumor always does. It reached a neighbor who had business ties with the Pereira family. It reached Coronel Mendez in the city. At a breakfast in a house with white columns, men whose lives had been built on the balance of power and markets discussed the quiet mutinies that kindness could unleash. "It will unsettle things," one said, stirring his coffee. "Once you let laborers see they can claim small decencies, they will ask for more." The remark was not a philosophical statement as much as a ledger entry, protection against any trend that might redistribute discipline. Back at San Vicente, the fighter's planning hardened. He called men he considered reliable and began to lay the architecture of reproach. "We cannot have an heir who undermines discipline," he said. "It will reach the others." The mood among the managerial class was not yet action. It was a simmer of concern and the rehearsal of objections. They would wait, watch, and, if necessary, act. When Joaquim heard of the fighters' unease, he did not flinch. He would not be a man who held orders only when they were convenient. He thought of Severino's gnarled hands, of the way coffee bean dust lodged in the creases like a memory. He thought, too, of Maria's quiet hands washing a fevered brow. That image lodged itself as a standard he was suddenly unable to dismiss. One morning, under a low sky heavy with the promise of rain, Joaquim made an order that surprised almost everyone. The fighter was to be dismissed, not in fury, but in a decisive, measured way. "You no longer serve San Vicente," he told the man with a calm that made onlookers catch their breath. The fighter's face reddened at the affront, but the dismissal was clean, with the kind of papers and currency that removed the fighter's recourse to complaint. He left the estate with his pride intact for the markets, but with a muttered vow that would not evaporate in the heat. The Chenzala watched with a mixture of relief and unease. In the kitchens, conversations hummed like a newly lit stove. Hope stirred with the memory of retribution. Some believed the change would hold, others said it would be an arrangement for a season before custom reasserted itself. Maria felt the shift in the air. She had not sought the fighter's dismissal. She had not wanted upheaval. She only wanted to keep men from dying of preventable neglect. But now the household's axis had tilted. That evening, as the sky went purple and the first thunder rumbled distant like a horse, men on horseback began to appear at the main road, neighbors pausing to observe, to confer. They rode with faces turned towards San Vicente as if reading a new chapter. Inside, Joaquim walked among his people with an awkwardness that was not masculine bravado, but a man newly learning the contours of care. He paused at Severino's pallet and held the old man's hand. Severino squeezed back, a small gesture heavy with the history of the plantation and the responsibility that had been transferred imperfectly to a young heir. The laughter that had filled the sickroom on that first day had been swallowed by a new sound, the whisper of consequences. Not every change would be easy, not every neighbor would approve. Yet the immediate reality at San Vicente had been altered. That is the thing about simple acts. When someone listens and acts, there is a ripple that moves outward, whether you wish it to or not. At the edge of the property, the riders dismounted and spoke in low voices beneath the fig trees. Their silhouettes were dark against the afterglow. One of them, tall, with a face like a carved log, spoke the name that carried weight. "Coronel Mendez must be told. He will not like half measures." Inside the house, Antonia sat at the table with the lamp casting a small pool of light. She folded her hands like a woman knitting thought into action. Her fear had become a shielded vigilance. "We have started something," she told Joaquim in the hush. "We must be sure we can hold it." Joaquim's hand, still thin from illness, closed over his mother's. "We will try," he said. That word was not a declaration. It was a decision. Outside in the Cenzala, Maria prepared clean linens. She moved like someone who had long ago accepted that change would be measured in small steps, and that grief and triumph often come braided together. She looked up when she heard the horses, then back to the cot where a child slept. The strategies she had once used to survive, silence, timing, careful generosity, would now have to expand into counsel, and perhaps, if things continued, into leadership. She felt the weight of that possibility, as a warmth in her chest and as something cool at the base of her neck, the knowledge that visibility invites both aid and retaliation. Somewhere in the dark, in the neighbor's house with the white columns, men poured more coffee and set their faces to the task of preserving the order they knew. Their plans were slow, legal, and social. Letters, an assembly of voices at the next market day, a whisper campaign that might hush Joaquim's impulsive reforms. But others in town, too, heard of the heir's change and thought differently. A merchant had once been in debt to San Vicente and had been well treated by an old master. He felt a scrap of loyalty and an inkling of profit in new arrangements that might make for steadier markets. There would be allies and enemies, and the battle, if it was a battle, would be of attrition. Lawyering of opinions, small economic choices, the slow building of consensus. At San Vicente, the first orders had been given and some had been obeyed. The wheel of days turned on new axles. Clean water drums sat closer to the huts. A carpenter patched holes in the roofs. The children slept with patched shoes on their feet, and a teacher from a nearby town had been invited, tentatively, to speak in a corner of the big house about reading for children on a Sunday. Still, the atmosphere was taut with the understanding that one morning might bring back everything they had tried to loosen. Maria thought of seeds and of how they sometimes need protection for a season before their roots become deep. She thought of how small acts must be watered and defended. She had saved a life not because she was miraculous, but because she was steady, knowledgeable, and brave enough to act when such acting risked more than it promised. People would call it a miracle or luck or fate. She only called it tending. And so San Vicente entered a new day with a thin line of hope and a web of dangers. The estate had shifted in degree, but not yet in order. Men who had ruled by habit were weighing the cost of a new ethic. A boy who had been an heir and a fever patient was awake and asking for the names of the people he had always taken for granted. The Cenzala hummed with cautious optimism. The horses at the gate waited at the edge of the property like question marks. The weather gathered itself to storm. In a small, almost private moment, Severino pulled Maria's hand toward his mouth and whispered, "You have done what is needed." His voice was thin and rough with usage, but the words were a benediction that carried no claim of prophecy. Maria only nodded. She did not seek praise. She had sown a seed, and was learning the patient faith of those who watch for roots. If you had been there in that room where they had laughed and then fell silent, you would have seen that the world sometimes changes in the hush between a breath and the next. A single question, spoken from a fevered mouth, had made visible what had been invisible. How will the others answer? That was the unasked question that now moved through San Vicente like a shadow. Outside, down the lane where dust settled in thin circles after each carriage, someone was writing a letter to a friend in São Paulo. Letters have a way of making small acts into news and news into policy. The pen moved slowly, and the ink did not yet reveal whether it would carry condemnation or applause. Inside the house a candle guttered. The coming night promised rain, and with it the kind of reckoning that can soften a field or wash away a fledgling crop. The first waves of change had begun, modest and fierce both. But to undo generations of practice requires time, allies, stubbornness, and endurance. Maria knew this. Joaquim did not yet fully know it. He was beginning to learn. Antonia feared it. The Faitor resented it. Coronel Mendez would hear of it soon enough. And amid all this, in the Cenzala's small courtyard where a boy had set a bowl of water for a stray dog, the youngest children stood watching the now quiet road as lanterns bobbed in the distance. They understood the story in a way adults often forgot. A single act of care can bend a life's trajectory. Whether it could bend a system was another matter. By the time the horses' silhouettes had melted into the dark, São Vicente slept under a sky washed with rain. In rooms both small and grand, people turned their faces to the quiet and wondered what the next day would demand. Maria laid her hands upon a child's forehead and counted the steadying breaths like beads. Seeds need tending, so do promises. The work would be long and at times dangerous. But somewhere in the house, in the simple act of a woman who had been dismissed by some, but listened to by an ailing boy, the beginning of something had been planted. The night deepened, and the wind in the tamarind trees sounded like quiet conversation. At dawn, decisions would be made. Men on horseback would return to their homes and councils would be called. The ledger of São Vicente had a new column, an entry no one could easily erase. The heir had been given back to them, and he had opened his eyes and asked for a man from the Cenzala. The meaning of that question would unfold in many ways, and in each the cost would be counted differently. For now, inside the quiet, Maria slept a few hours between tending. She dreamed not of power but of the river, where she had once learned how to hold a child's head so the fever would not take them. She dreamed of a seed in the dark soil, waiting for the first true rain. If you find yourself moved by this kind of story, consider joining the channel. There are more quiet reckonings like this one to hear. The morning after the riders had ridden home, São Vicente felt like a place that had been tested and found still standing but with new cracks to watch. Men who kept accounts of every weight and measure began to tally resistance. A dismissed overseer, barrels of water closer to the huts, a few extra loaves of bread issued at dusk. For some, these were mercies counted as luxuries. For others, they were the first small steps away from a language of humiliation. Word of those steps reached the town and was shaped there by the mouths of men with more to lose. Coronel Mendez read the news between the lines of a market report and felt annoyance grow into alarm. He summoned those who listened to him at the club, a low room with smoke-stained beams and a long table where the coffee tasted of numbers. "If this sort of softness takes root," he said, tapping ash into a tin, "we will find confusion in our fields and trouble in our ledgers." The sentence was practical, not moral. The climate of commerce, in his calculation, demanded predictable labor. They planned in ways that were mostly polite. Letters were written, careful, scalding, with the measured venom of men who used ink as a weapon. A notice, drafted to look like a courteous inquiry, reached the Pereira house. Neighbors speaking of concerns and risk to local stability. Some spoke of a boycott of São Vicente's coffee, should the heir continue to pursue reforms that undermined the customary order. Others, more blunt, hinted that a man in Joaquim's position who persisted in undermining established practices might find his public reputation and therefore his business connections diminished. Joaquim read the paper and folded it badly into his coat until the crease marked his fingers. He had not relished the act of upsetting balance, but the look of Severino's shoulders in the harvest rows had lodged like a stone in his chest. If kindness meant standing against a chorus of polite men, then kindness required him to stand. Not all responses were hostile. News travels in unpredictable directions. A merchant in São Paulo, who had once bought coffee in good seasons from São Vicente and lost money in bad ones because of unreliable supply, was listening to new rumors through his clerk. He came to the property, first with an emissary, then in person, bringing with him a lawyer whose papers smelled of ink and a cautious promise. If São Vicente committed to a set of practices that would ensure steadier, cleaner harvests and more reliable deliveries, merchants could offer regular contracts and a small line of credit to smooth the transition. The proposition was pragmatic, market stability in exchange for humane oversight and predictable production. Dr. Henrique Tavares arrived one humid afternoon with the same neat gait of a man who carried systems in his head. He spoke of contracts and reputations and the slow mathematics of markets. He did not come with grand speeches about justice or the language of reformers. He came with suggestions and the kind of support that could insulate a man like Joaquim from mere gossip. "We can draft something," he said, unfolding a sheet of paper and pointing to lines. "A commitment to standards. A notice to buyers that São Vicente will guarantee quality, and in return merchants will ensure steady purchase." It was not a salvation, only scaffolding. Those scaffoldings mattered. The loudest threats were legal-sounding ones at first, boycotts, calls to neighbors, but beneath them sat the quieter, more dangerous threat of force. Men who rode under the belief that their customs were law and that any deviation deserved to be corrected by muscle. That threat took the shape of an evening in which, under a bruised sky, a group of riders returned to São Vicente, not all wearing the faces of neighbors, but the stern set of men who did not like being crossed. They came first to the gate, boots stirring dust, and then sent a modest delegation of their own. The delegation was mannered at first, respectful words, a tone that belonged to men who thought themselves protectors of order. Coronel Mendez himself did not ride in with the first group, but his presence was felt in the bowed posture of those who spoke as if he watched over them. "Your family has long been part of the structure that keeps this district running," said one. "A certain firmness is expected of you. What you are doing, watering down discipline, will untether other estates. For your sake, consider this a friendly admonition." Joaquim heard their words in the room where a few men sat around a table lit dimly by a lamp. He listened with an attention different from the fever-addled a week before. Now he had a ledger of compassion he wished to follow, and he also had a sense that leading meant paying a cost. He answered plainly, "I will not quietly return to a way that allowed a man to be starved into sickness for a missed bean. São Vicente will care for its people." The sentence landed like a small bell. It was not rhetorical, it was a choice. That choice did not end the pressure. Instead, it turned polite admonition into a sharper test. Late one night, as the moon rode low, a party of men came to the edge of the Chenzala. They did not enter the huts, but they rode past and shouted warnings. A few of them threw a flap of paper onto the porch, a note threatening legal action, hinting that neighbors could call in inspectors, or suggesting that investments would dry up for São Vicente's owners if the estate continued to deviate from expected norms. The tactic relied on fear rather than force, threats that would strike at reputation and pocket. Inside the Chenzala, the people rose at the night noises, hearts quick. Children clutched blankets. Severino, who had recovered enough to move slowly and laugh sometimes, sat up and gripped the edge of his pallet. Maria went outside and stood beneath the low eaves, letting the humid air cool her face. She could hear the horses' hooves fade into the distance. The sound of the riders had the effect of a bell tolling a future alarm. When Joaquim learned that men had come and gone like that, he did not entertain fear as an option. He entertained calculation. Dr. Henrique's plan provided a certain protective layer, merchants who would stake their commerce on the estate's new practices. That support made the threats less likely to convert into wholesale economic isolation. It also gave Joaquim a public argument. The reforms were not merely mercy, but method. I promised a steady harvests by improving living conditions became a pragmatic pitch to the market. Cleaner beans, healthier workers, more consistent yields. If the merchants found it profitable, some neighbors might find themselves outmaneuvered by demand. Still, the men who valued the old order felt aggrieved, and grievance is a force that often seeks outlet. A spy among the day laborers reported rumors back to the fighters' sympathizers, small acts amplified and dressed as sedition. In a tavern, men once comfortable with casual cruelty began to speak with a new boldness. "If he keeps this up, we will be ruined by example," one said, slamming his mug down. The sentiment shaped itself into a plan, not to attack São Vicente openly, but to test its mettle by refusing some business, by undercutting prices in the market, by whispering that the Pereira name was no longer bankable. The first month of pressure was a tasting of endurance. Suppliers delayed deliveries of certain goods. Some buyers paused. Neighbors murmured and courted the ears of the local judge. Joaquim, who had never made more than household choices before, was forced to learn the mechanics of leverage. He met with Dr. Henrique, who explained the legal means by which merchants could publicly commit to the estate's contracts in such a way that buyers elsewhere would think twice before joining a boycott. The language was dry, but it mattered. They trade in norms, Dr. Henrique told Joaquim, but merchants trade in certainty. If we can make São Vicente's harvests the surest, their threat loses teeth. In the Chenzala, the people watched the shifts with guarded optimism. Maria kept doing the work that had first made her visible, tending fevers, teaching a rhythmic song to children, arranging that clean water be pumped daily at dawn. The small things that had seemed ceremonial, mending shoes, patching roofs, bringing warm broth, became, under Joaquim's orders, part of a new routine. A young woman named Rosa, who had a talent for sewing, began to organize a nightly repair circle. A boy of 12, who had once watched the harvest from the periphery, was given a small task of tending a trough. The water he carried sparked a responsibility in him that shone brighter than any adult pronouncement. Not everything went smoothly. The fighters' old allies, who had been dismissed or marginalized by the new orders, struck in subtler ways. They withheld certain favors, delayed repairs, and favored workers who were more compliant with their memory of authority. One man who had once been cordial now refused to sell a plowshare on credit. Simple acts of petty obstruction cost time and energy. Joaquim learned quickly that benevolence required oversight. He began walking the fields more often, not with a rigid cane or a parade of authority, but with a slow presence that let people see him listen. He learned names he had never known. He learned which huts had holes in the roof that leaked during the first real rain. Antonia, meanwhile, recorded her anxieties in a small notebook she kept hidden under the teacup by her bedside. The entries were occasional, not a full chronicle, but they revealed a woman torn between relief at her son's survival and dread at the erosion of certainty. In one entry she wrote of her husband, gone these many years, and how he had taught her the grammar of standing in society. She confessed that seeing Joaquim's earnestness stirred in her an affection that worried her, because kindness could be imitated without understanding. Her pages were full of small confessions. She feared scandal almost as much as she feared cruelty. But she also noted with a startled tenderness how a child in the Cenzala once returned a loaf of bread he'd hidden because he had seen Severino's cough and no longer thought hoarding was survival. These inner shifts mattered because structures of cruelty rely on eroding empathy. To the outside observer, the changes at São Vicente might seem small. To those within, each act was a tilt away from an old gravity. A new teacher stood on the veranda one Sunday and read aloud to a huddle of children. Their mouths formed words they had never seen on paper. One small boy, whose hands had never held a pencil, traced a line that looked like an A and felt the joy of making a symbol of his name. The teacher's presence did more than teach letters. It made faces of the future legible. Pressure met the estate at multiple points. At markets, some buyers still hesitated. Neighbors held private meetings where they debated whether the Pereira family's reputation warranted trusting an heir who had shown too much softness. Perhaps the most dangerous pressure was the everyday skepticism, the kind that waits to see whether any reform sticks beyond the novelty of a few months. Joaquim felt the weight of that skepticism in his bones. He slept poorly, and sometimes woke to the image of the fighter's muttered vow. He also learned how to measure the depth of his own resolve. A test came in the form of a public gathering, a harvest fair in the town where neighboring landowners met with merchants, clerks, and local officials. Coronel Mendez, who had cultivated alliances with a patient hand, used the fair to press the question of São Vicente's reliability. He stood beneath a banner and spoke with the ease of a man who had long held the floor. "We must agree on standards," he said. "We cannot allow independent experiments to undermine our region's standing." His words were polished, the tone of someone looking to build consensus. Dr. Henrique, who had come with Joaquim to the fair, leaned forward and spoke of different standards, ones that would create a brand for São Vicente's coffee. "Quality is not merely the outcome of labor enforced by fear," he told the council. "It is the product of steady hands, regular meals, and clean water." The argument combined morality with commerce. It did not abolish opposition, but it shifted the debate from accusation to metrics. Merchants who wanted consistent beans began to consider the possibility that humane oversight could produce steadier results. Some nodded, others stayed neutral. The showdown that would decide the estate's immediate future was not thunderous. It was a day of small, fierce acts. One dawn a group of men rode past the Cenzala with the boldness of those who thought their message could be rapped like a knuckle on a door and heard. They came to the gate and demanded a meeting with Joaquim. Their spokesman, who had the clipped voice of one used to getting his way, read an ultimatum. Rescind the reforms, reinstate the old authority of the Faitor, or face the consequences of being ostracized from certain markets and partnerships. The demand was both economic and publicly shaming. Joaquim did not flinch. He called the men to the veranda and spoke plainly. "I cannot undo what is right," he said. "Severino will be cared for. The Cenzala will have water. The man dismissed from his post will not return to practices I cannot condone." The tone was neither theatrical nor defiant. It was the voice of someone who had enumerated the cost and found compassion worth paying. The men on the veranda, arrogant with the backing of old alliances, expected pushback. When it did not come, one of them threatened to call a council to declare San Vicente an unreliable source. Joaquim, feeling the precariousness of his position, turned to Dr. Henrique. The lawyer took a fold of paper from his carriage and placed it upon the table. A contract signed by a circle of merchants agreeing to buy San Vicente's next harvest, provided certain standards were met, along with an offer of a line of credit to maintain operations while the transition took hold. The signature list was not long, but it was enough to make the would-be enforcers pause. This was not victory, it was leverage. Coronel Mendez's men were effective because they relied on networks. Those networks could be tamed if counter-networks offered something their members found valuable. The merchants' signatures meant that a boycott would be expensive for the men who proposed it. The legal scaffolding did not remove risk, but it made risk into an economic calculation rather than a unilateral exercise of muscle. In the days that followed, the whispers of retaliation lost their bluntness. The men who had expected to bend San Vicente to their will found that commerce could be a counterweight. Some grudgingly accepted the new reality. Others hardened into quiet resentment, biding their time. The Fator left the property with papers exchanged and a sum that eased his departure. He took his men and his pride to a neighboring fazenda, where the old order was still observed. Change at San Vicente was not sudden. There were days when a roof leaked and a plan delayed, days when the market dipped and creditors sent notes that tightened like a noose. But there was something different in the way people moved. The time it took to fetch water now included a smile exchanged with the one who tended the pump. The act of having a teacher on a Sunday was a vivid promise that a life could carry other meanings than toil. Maria organized the children into a small grouping by the tamarind tree and taught them to make letters with sticks in the dust when paper was scarce. They giggled and pricked their fingers on thorns and learned that a name could be shaped into things. Severino, whose life had been long and full of harvest and stories, lived 3 more years. His passing was gentle, not sudden. He sat beneath the house's broad eaves, a patchwork blanket over his knees, while around him the Cenzala hummed with low voices that recited stories he had told them 100 times. Maria sat at his side, holding his hand with the same steadiness she had once used to mop a fevered brow. Joaquim came often to sit beside the old man, not with the posture of patronage, but with a tenderness grown from attendance. In Severino's final hours, he looked at Joaquim and nodded, a gesture like signing an invisible parchment, and said, in a voice that was mostly gone, "You listened." The words were small, but they were all anyone needed. 3 years changed a landscape in ways measured and modest. The Cenzala's huts were moved slightly back from the marshiest ground. The carpenter's work had given them sturdier shingles. A small well, clay-lined and ringed with stones, provided water that tasted of the earth itself and of the hands that had so carefully dug it. There was a teacher who came on Sundays to teach more than the alphabet. She taught measurement and bookkeeping to a few adults, and reading to children who had once thought the world had no letters for them. A small lending account, managed by Joaquim and supervised in part by Dr. Henrique, provided seed grain for times when rains failed. The estate published a small notice, modest, neat, inviting merchants to see San Vicente's methods and purchase its coffee on conditions that guaranteed steady prices for a given quality. Not all neighbors came around. Coronel Mendez remained a man whose world had been built by another logic, and he rubbed against Joaquim's decisions as a stone against another. He never raised a public hand. His resistance took shape as a cold shoulder and the circulation of skeptical gossip. But the blunt threats did not return. The merchants had their standards and their brand to protect. They did not enjoy losing a reliable source of coffee. In time, some neighbors adjusted their balances, finding that a steady, humane operation could be as economically viable as one built on fear. Maria's role in all of this became both more public and more private. She did not relish being called a leader. She preferred the soft rhythm of tending, but people sought her counsel. Joaquim, in particular, came to rely on her guidance, not because he had to, but because he valued it. On chilly mornings, he would walk to the Cenzala and find Maria sorting herbs or teaching a girl to sew a seam. He would stand a moment in the doorway and ask a practical question about a roof or a ration, and then he would stand longer to hear what she had to say about how to listen to a community's needs. One fall afternoon, when the sky was iron cold and the coffee cherries were being picked with a care that felt different from the old frenzy, Joaquim took a notebook and wrote a longer entry than his earlier, fever-shaken scribbles. This one was not a list of mercies, but a record of obligations. He wrote of wages that would be fairer, of rules that would protect men from arbitrary punishment, of a small fund to mediate disagreements. He did not write as a convert to grand theory. He wrote as a man who had learned that attention and routine could build endurance. Not everything at San Vicente changed. There were old patterns that resisted, habits that had been taught across generations, and that needed time and example to be unlearned. A few men still remembered with fondness certain severities that had once, in their imagining, produced order. Those men found other work or retired to corners where their memories would not be provocative. The Cenzala still held grief for those who had been taken from them, for the small indignities that could never be entirely undone. The plantation's ledger still bore marks of a long history. In the small court of people who watched the estate, the measure of change was not heroic but real. A child who had once hidden bread to survive now brought his loaf to his grandmother. A woman named Rosa ran a tiny sewing circle whose profits bought extra corn for the infirm. A boy who had watched Severino fall in the field learned to mark a field for pests and was hired as an apprentice by a diligent foreman who had come to accept the estate's new ethos. These were not sweeping reforms, but the slow architecture of better days. Maria, who had been visible in a way she had not sought, contemplated the edges of freedom and belonging. Some offered to help her claim a new life outside. The promise of a city where a skilled woman might earn wages and live apart from the Cenzala's shadow. Others spoke of passing her a small purse with money unaccounted for in ledgers. Maria considered these offers with the same practical mind she had always used. She knew risks and the hospitality of contingency. In the end, she chose to remain, not because she loved a life of servitude, but because the community she had helped tend needed someone who knew how to stitch the small seams of care. Her choice was not a surrender, but a complicated loyalty, one rooted in the knowledge that change sometimes requires those who can teach others how to tend what is fragile. Severino's death was mourned openly. The Cenzala gathered and told stories with relish and sorrow, and in the middle of those stories Maria stood and spoke of tending as both duty and love. Joaquim stood beside her and listened as friends spoke of an elder whose work could not be repaid. "You can change things," Maria said once in a quiet moment near Severino's quiet bed. "Just have the courage to plant." The words were simple and true, less a command than a counsel. They lodged in those who heard them like seeds in soil. The years that followed were neither a triumphal march nor a retreat into complacency. San Vicente became a place where small improvements stacked into habit. The well provided a steady supply of water. The shingles on the Cenzala roofs held against storm. Children learned to read. When disputes emerged, a small council composed of Joaquim, Antonia, Maria, and a representative of the laborers met to weigh the facts rather than the whims of a single overseer. The council was imperfect and sometimes slow, but its existence alone mattered. It taught a generation that decisions could be deliberative rather than punitive. Joaquim did not become a saint. He remained human. Sometimes he misstepped, sometimes he deferred to what his mother urged, sometimes his impatience showed in tone rather than deed. But he learned to accept accountability. He signed small decrees in the ledger and sent letters to merchants explaining practices in plain language. He grew less interested in extravagant displays and more in the quiet fact that mornings could be easier for the people who rose before him. Antonia, whose fear had once been a shield for lineage, found a different pride in these changes. She still worried about reputations and credit, but she also sat quietly by the well sometimes and smiled when a child recited a poem for her. She kept her notebook, but its pages thickened with observations of endurance rather than only anxieties. In private, she wrote to a cousin in the city, explaining in measured words how a household had to balance survival and mercy. Her letters did not shout. They offered a model she had learned to inhabit. What had begun with a bowl of tepid water and a slow hand had become a series of practices that, while modest, made life marginally less perilous for many. It was a legacy of tending rather than triumph. And yet that legacy contained its own strength, the stubborn hope that small, consistent acts create a new normal. In the late afternoon of the third year, the estate fields glimmered. A teacher called roll at a small table under the tamarind, and a line of children recited the alphabet, loud and crooked and proud. A woman who had once mended shoes sold some of her clothwork in town, and brought back a small coil of thread she used to teach a girl how to stitch. A merchant who had once been skeptical now sent a cart that bore not only the weight of coffee, but also a certificate that recognized São Vicente's commitment to humane practices. The certificate was humble, but it mattered. It meant other buyers began to ask questions and think differently. On an evening that held both heat and a promise of relief, Maria stood at the edge of the Cenzala, watching children play under lantern light. She had lived long enough to know the contour of grief and the shape of contentment. Joaquim approached, carrying an envelope from Dr. Henrique. He handed it to her without fuss. Inside was a small account, funds that would pay for a small schoolroom and a chest of books to be shared. Maria's hands, steady and sure, touched the paper as if testing the weight of an unseen river. She did not speak of glory. She thought instead of the work, finding a teacher, arranging benches, gathering a few lanterns for evening lessons. She thought of the future in small increments, the way a woman plants seeds, not all of which she will live to see. They walked together a little way down the lane, shoulders close though not touching, the air smelling of coffee and damp earth. Joaquim did not make pronouncements of finality. He spoke of plans, humble, sensible, and persistent. "We will need to find someone who can teach arithmetic," he said. "We will need to keep the well clean." His voice carried the ordinary care of someone who had learned that governance is less about grand gestures and more about ordinary maintenance. Maria thought of the river where she had learned to calm a child's fevered head, and of the day she had washed a man's forehead and asked nothing but his life in return for her work. She thought of Severino's steady hands and of the many small hands that had kept the Cenzala a living place. "Tend," she said finally, as if reminding herself of how to be. "Tend what you can. Teach others how to tend." The conversation did not offer certainty, only a plan. It was, in its own way, the truest kind of hope, grounded and patient. Years later, people would tell the story of that fevered day in the sickroom as if it were a parable of sudden change. Yet those who had been there remembered differently. They remembered the slow stitchwork, the water in the basin, the small bowls of broth carried at dusk, the carpenter's careful nails. They recalled a man's vulnerability as the hinge that opened his ears, and a woman's steady hands as the instrument that set new things in motion. At Severino's grave, a small mound not far from the tamarind, people left stones and small tokens. Joaquim stood with Antonia and with Maria, who had no need for a public role, but who was given, by those who loved her, a quiet acknowledgement. She accepted neither title nor praise. Her reward was different, the sight of children learning and of a community that now argued, sometimes clumsily, for one another. In the end, the estate did not overturn the world. Systems persisted beyond the reach of any single act. But within São Vicente, a lasting shift had occurred. Where arbitrary cruelty once broke bodies and spirits, a new set of routines guarded them. The change was neither complete nor perfect. It was, however, real. Maria's last words, offered on a slow morning when she felt her bones more than she once had, were neither loud nor prophetic. She sat in the shade and watched a small group of children learn to carve letters into soft wood. One of them, now a lanky youth who had once carried a water trough, looked up and asked her if she believed the world could be different. Maria smiled, and her voice, even as it thinned, carried the same steady cadence she had used at a fevered bedside years ago. "You can change things," she said, touching the wood with a finger as if planting. "Just have the courage to plant." The image of a seed, small and unassuming, took root in the hearts of those who knew her. It became less a slogan and more a practice: plant, tend, defend, and repeat. That practice did not promise to erase sorrow or to overturn the weight of structures beyond a single property, but it taught a generation that attentive work could alter trajectories. People began to recognize tending as a form of courage. If you carry this story with you, consider dropping one word below, change, and tell us what single act made the difference to you. Share this with someone who needs to hear that listening, coupled with steady action, can begin something that lasts.